Bueno, buenos días a todos y todas. Bienvenidos al tercer día del primer encuentro de Lingüística Experimental. También saludamos a todos aquellos que se encuentran en nuestra transmisión de YouTube. El día de hoy, el miércoles, vamos a comenzar con una conferencia del doctor Jesse Harris que se titula Evidence for Structural Prediction in Sentence Processing. El doctor Harris nos acompaña de la UCLA. En un momento les voy a leer su semblanza. His work addresses how various sources of information contribute to the construction of linguistic representation during real-time sentence processing. Recent projects include topics such as focus sensitivity, prosodic alignment, clausal ellipsis, perspective talking, and dependency resolution. Well, welcome to Dr. Harris. You can start.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. And so first of all, I'd like to thank the organizers for the invitation. It's a big honor. I wish I could be there in person. Unfortunately, the timing didn't quite work out, but I will be in Mexico City at the beginning of July for a few months in case anyone is interested in chatting about their research or following up. And I've really appreciated the live stream on YouTube. It's been really fun to follow along and to see all the talks, the kind of the range and the diversity of all the topics. So thank you again. So I will be talking about structural prediction in sentence processing. The talk is a little bit long and a little bit dense, so I apologize. If anything is unclear, please feel free to stop me and I can clarify. So I want to start at the beginning about some kind of core assumptions regarding sentence parsing. So we think that the language parser is a kind of a sub-mechanism within a larger suite of mechanisms in sentence processing. In particular, its goal or its role is to incrementally assign syntactic structure to whatever input it receives, and then revise the analysis or analyses as is needed. So we can take, for example, something like one, and just to illustrate here, what the parser does is it just incrementally, so word by word, assign structure to the input that it has at the time, right? So we'll go through a sentence and it will give its best attempt at a structural analysis. How this analysis is achieved is, of course, the domain of a lot of research in this area, and decades of psycholinguistics research, I think, has explored various strategies that might be used to structure the input in real time. So I think that there's some things that we certainly know, or we think we know about how this parsing process works. So I'm going to start with the known knowns. First of all, as I mentioned, it's largely incremental, right? So it doesn't wait in order to structure the input. One way of saying this property is that it's eager or it's greedy, right? So it takes in whatever information it can at the time. This seems to result in a fast and efficient processing system. And it's kind of amazing, right? That if you are processing a sentence in your native language, you are able to have an interpretation incredibly fast with relatively few errors. So that's the kind of mystery that we're interested in. There are, of course, many known unknowns and probably plenty unknown unknowns, but I can only deal with the former. So some questions, and this is really going to be the focus of the talk here, are to what extent does the processor predict or anticipate words or structure ahead of the input, right? So in addition to being incremental and eager, we want to know the extent to which it is anticipatory. If it does make predictions ahead of the input, then we would like to know what the content and detail of those predictions are. So what is prediction? There's a lot of different ways that we might cash this idea out. I'll take a kind of a minimal sense from a review paper by Cooperberg and Jaeger, who write that context influences the state of the language processing system before the bottom-up input is observed. And there's been a number of different, by now, many studies have addressed this issue and found support for prediction, at least in the minimal sense, in multiple levels of linguistic structure. So this would include prominence, the lexicon, right? So you're faster to decision times or word recognition to targets that are predictable from the context, larger phrasal constituents and structures, larger portions of the structure as well, and then most plausibly discourse as well, right? So where predictable aspects of situations will be processed more easily, we don't have gaps in turn taking, and so on. So the quote mentioned bottom-up information, so I thought I would sort of explicate that for just a moment. There's sort of like two broad types of information processing, bottom-up and top-down. Bottom-up is really whatever you have to do in order to interpret the signal or the input on its own terms, right? So top-down is pretty much everything else besides the processing of the pure signal, and it's characterized by optimizing contextual information. So kind of a big split with at least historically in research on parsing has been the extent to which top-down information is used during like real-time online sentence processing. We know we have to have bottom-up processing because otherwise you would just be like hallucinating the input, right? So that's kind of a given. And then models vary to the extent to which they allow top-down processing to influence a parse at any given point. So a related question is the activeness of top-down processing. So you could imagine that you have a fair bit of top-down processing, but nonetheless, the parser is still reactive. So where you would structure the input using both bottom-up and top-down sources, but really any advantage that you would find would be due to integration, right? Another view is that top-down processing involves some proactive mechanisms or processes so that you would predict or anticipate likely continuations of the input that you have so far. So let's look at a specific example. This is from DeLong and colleagues. It's now 20 years old, but it's kind of a classic. So they've got this highly constraining sentence like to. On a windy day, the boy went outside to fly. And if you're like most people, you would probably complete the sentence with a phrase like a kite, right? So that might be kind of the most prominent continuation that you would find. There are certainly other possibilities. So we've run plenty of norming studies. Some people will put things like a drone or even in airplane, right? But what's interesting, and this has sparked a lot of research in this area, is that if you capitalize on the English determiner system that has some allomorphy, so you have variants like a and depending on the word that follows, you can then give the parser a cue as to what comes up next. So on a windy day, the boy went outside to fly, and And then here that rules out your maybe most likely continuations, like you can't say an kite or an drone. So you're left with something like an airplane. They looked at the effects of predictability in an EEG study. In an EEG study, as I'm sure that you all know, you wear these caps and you measure the electromagnetic flux change around the scalp. And this is a really great method for looking at fast and automatic responses. And in the work on EEG, there's been kind of the discovery of a number of components that are characteristically responsive to certain kinds of anomalies. And maybe the kind of best studied one is the N400 effect. And so this is kind of a response that is sort of exaggerated in response to anomaly, and usually it's semantic anomaly or some kind of failed expectation. So you always have in kind of an N400 in the signal, but if you have in kind of an anomalous form like whipped cream tastes anxious, which is sort of anomalous, right? That's sort of semantically very strange. You find that there's an increased N400 effect here. So they use this method in order to explore how rapid people would respond to um, anomaly even ahead of the input. So here they've got their sentence. The day was breezy, so the boy went outside to fly. And then if subjects were presented with an as opposed to a, then they see an N400 effect that's indicative of a failed expectation or an anomaly on the article. So even before you get to the content word. And this penalty, this N400 effect, continues on to the next word like airplane. So that was taken as a fairly good indication that the language processing system seems to predict at least word forms ahead of the input. And so a lot of the work that's been done on this area has been restricted largely to kind of lexical predictions. And there's various kinds of accounts of this phenomenon. And the idea is that the processor, or at least one idea is that the processor probabilistically pre-activates sets of features or even specific words in highly constraining context. And this activation makes the integration of this word easier when it's confirmed. And there's even some studies that seem to indicate that readers and listeners might even commit to a particular word if the context is extremely constraining, right? So you really kind of can't have many other options. So that's sort of where a lot of the literature is, but there's another question that hasn't received nearly as much attention, and that has to do with structural prediction. And the question here is, does the language processor predict upcoming structure in addition to predicting lexical content? There is some evidence for this already in parasitic gap constructions or the prediction of ellipsis structures. But we're going to look at a different kind of phenomenon. We'll be looking at correlative adverbs, and this has also received a bit of attention as well. So I want to give you now a bit of a game plan for the rest of the talk here. We're going to use correlative adverbs, and these are things like either, neither, both, that will be paired with a characteristic connective as a window into structural prediction. So I'll be presenting three experiments. Experiments 1 and 2 were done in collaboration with Stephanie Rich. And so the first experiment really addresses the basics of structural prediction. So does the processor make structural predictions on the basis of the position of this word either? Experiment two is really about what happens when the predictions are not realized, right? So that you make a prediction and it fails in some way. Is that prediction abandoned or does it linger on in memory in some way? And finally, experiment three deals with parallelism, and this is really part of a larger question that addresses whether structural predictions interact with more general principles like those of parallelism. Okay, so a little bit of background on the kind of structures that we'll be looking at. Correlative adverbs, as I mentioned, is a name for these constructions like either or, neither nor, and so on. They occur with a unique connective. So if you've got something like Mary drank either coffee or tea, right? Or Mary drank neither coffee nor tea. Mary drank both coffee and tea. And then my favorite, Mary drank not only coffee, but also tea, right? And so these are sort of highly restricted. Saying Mary drank either coffee nor tea to me sounds ungrammatical. Either coffee and tea is pretty horrible. Either coffee but tea, I just kind of can't quite make sense of what's being said here. So it really seems that once you have an either, you've got a pretty good chance of receiving an or. A little bit of kind of theoretical background that I think will sort of help parse some of the predictions later on. They're kind of going back to early work by Barbara Partee and Matt Ruth in the 80s. There's an idea that whenever you have a connective, it really needs to be of the same semantic or syntactic type. You see divergences in terms of the syntax, but the idea is that really to connect two things, they need to be comparable in some way. I sometimes use this term juncs because that's sort of compatible with conjuncts and disjuncts. So just know that I've been a bit lazy there. Right. And so the idea is that if you've got, if you're disjoining or conjoining an XP, right, you'll have something of the same category. And then there's another idea by Schwartz called the left bracket thesis, and that's the idea that the either, neither, or both, and so on will mark the left edge of the first conjunct. So it's kind of like a scope marking um, particle, right? So either here is going to then mark the left edge of this XP. That's the idea, right? So I think you can probably already kind of anticipate how this might be useful in looking at predictive processing. A lot of the work and some of what I'll be talking about deals with garden path ambiguities. And these are sentence fragments that are structurally ambiguous up to one point in the string, but then get a resolution by the end. And so six is, I've said this 1,000, probably many thousands of times, and it always catches me up just a tiny bit. So the horse raced past a barn, and the idea is if you get something like fell, then you have to reanalyze raced, not as a main verb, but as a verb in a reduced relative clause structure, right? So this is a very hard to process sentence. When I teach this material, over half of my students say, I don't know what that means, and then you have to give them the resolution, and then they can understand it. One that's hard but still a bit easier is something like heaven. While the men hunted the deer in the forest scattered. Right. And so this ends up being a difficult to process sentence because you have to realize that, oh, deer is not an object of hunt, but rather hunt is in intransitive. And so the deer now is a subject of the next clause, right? So these are sort of the bread and butter of people who work on parsing. And then the last one, which is one that we will be dealing with quite a bit, is a what's called a DPS ambiguity. So the sailor kissed Marie or her sister. Seems like there's no problem with that. But then if I continue on this with laughed, then this becomes slightly harder, right? So here now, her sister is not the object of kissed, right? But instead, it's the subject of an upcoming clause. And so there's a very strong preference to initially interpret a temporarily ambiguous disjunction like eight to be as small as possible, right? So there's a preference to kind of take or her sister to conjoin DPs rather than sentences. So I'll walk you through a few trees. Because this can be helpful for seeing what's at stake here. So the sailor kissed Marie, right? We might have sort of a standard SVO interpretation here. And then I get or her sister. And so the idea is that I now have to adjoin this disjunction, which we'll call a copy, to the NP Marie. This involves a bit of restructuring, but it's not very taxing on the processor. But let's say I get the sailor kissed Marie or her sister laughed. Then, right, if I built up the structure up to this point, that and it looks like what we have on the left, there's no way to integrate this verb laughed. So what I have to do instead is completely restructure the sentence, and I get the sailor kissed Marie or her sister laughed, where now I'm conjoining two sentences instead of two noun phrases, right? And this is quite a lot of restructuring for the parser to have to do. Okay. So it was observed early on in some of this work that a particle like either might serve as a cue to disambiguate, so that you would instead of going for a DP or an object disjunction, it's a cue that you have a disjunction of two sentences. So 10A is quite odd. I find this sort of ungrammatical, but some people sort of say it's just not quite right. Either the sailor kissed Marie or her sister, right? So I really have a hard time with this, especially if it's expressed in a single prosodic phrase. Um, but something like 10b is perfectly acceptable. So either the sailor kissed Marie or her sister laughed. That seems to be entirely fine. And so the idea here is really just that a sentence initial either can be used to make predictions about the upcoming structure, which would then help you avoid a misinterpretation, help you avoid the garden path. So just schematically, the idea is that if I get either, then you know that you have this sort of more complex structure here. Right? Okay, so so I've got either, and here I sort of already know that I'm going to get, when I get to something like her sister, then I can integrate that as a subject rather than be tempted by the object interpretation. Right? So that's kind of the utility of this thing. There's been some work on this, and this was done mainly by Adrian Staub and Chuck Clifton. And they found that this sort of penalty for an NPS disjunction garden path is reduced but not eliminated when either disambiguates towards the S disjunction, right? So this would sort of seem to indicate that, well, maybe the parser makes predictions, but they're not all that strong. And so their story, as far as I understand, is really just that the NP analysis is initially adopted, but then the S interpretation becomes easier to restructure the sentence. So they had sentences like 15, either the boys will use the skis or the sled will make the deliveries. Yep. And so what they found is that there was a reduction of a penalty for the second disjunct starting with the sled if they presented it with a sentence initial either. They also found that the effect holds even when the object is an implausible object NP. So that would suggest, at least according to them, that when you get Linda bought the red car or her husband, you initially take her husband as something that Linda bought, despite that it's kind of implausible, right? So that this preference for having a very small disjunction is incredibly strong. Okay, so that's the idea there. But one thing to note is that correlatives are a tricky bunch. They don't sort of unambiguously signal the structure based on their position. So there are a number of non-correlative uses of either. So they didn't interview either teenager for the job, right? There's no or here, and you wouldn't expect one. Or a case like 17b, they didn't interview the teenager either, right? So this seems to be like a presuppositional particle. Um, so we've looked at either in corpora and found that either accurately predicts the correct syntax in less than 75% of the text. So it's very strong, right? I mean, 75% is nothing to sneeze at, but it's still not, 100%. So, I mean, and you can see this in the range of examples like 18. So John ate either rice or beans. We'll call this the same because rice and beans, the two disjuncts, are sort of equivalent in terms of their syntax. 18b, John either ate rice or beans. This is completely acceptable, right? So you have what's called a left-shifted interpretation, where either appears farther to the left than you would expect under the left bracket thesis, which is the idea that either in similar particles mark the left edge of the disjunction. You also have cases where either will appear farther to the right than you might expect. So this is John ate either rice or he ate beans. And these are all acceptable and attested in corpora. Um, I'm not really going to talk about this that much. I just wanted to mention that there are lots of interesting theoretical ways of accounting for this deviation. So one is that you've got movement of either from a position of the left edge over or either to the left or to the right. An ellipsis theory will kind of claim that whenever you have kind of a mismatch, this reveals an ellipsis in the second disjunction. So John ate either rice or beans is really elliptical for John either ate rice or ate beans. And finally, a view that I find compelling is the focus marker theory, where basically it's that either is really a focus marker. But what's kind of important for our purposes that comes out from this literature is that there are certain constraints on the placement of either and or. So then Dickin and Bayer and others have found that either and or cannot cross a CP boundary for many speakers. And we've already kind of talked about some of these cases, but it's important, so I want to just reiterate it. So either John ate rice or he ate beans is totally fine. Mary said either that John ate rice or he ate beans, also completely fine. But for me and most other speakers that we've uh, tested, something like 23 or 23b is quite bad. So either John either John ate rice or beans just sounds incomplete in a way. Or Mary said either that John ate rice or beans sounds really bad. All right. So it looks like there's some kind of constraint on the relationship between either and or, and we're going to capitalize on this in the experiments that follow. So I just want to sort of briefly talk about some corpus work that we've done. We wanted to get an indication of the sort of distribution of same left-shifted and right-shifted occurrences of either in naturally occurring speech. So this is a corpus experiment from that looks at instances of either and neither taken from NPR. We looked at, we sampled 20,000 um, unscripted radio interviews, and over 2,000 examples of either and neither were observed, and we've looked at about half of those so far. And just this is actually a very kind of complex picture, but I just want to give you kind of the basics here. There's a very strong preference for having kind of the same dis, dis, the same disjunction sizes. So this is just under 75% for either. It's much stronger for neither, which is interesting. There are many, far fewer cases of neither than there were of either. But it looks like you've got a much kind of stronger preference for having the same disjuncts on either side. Um, Now but there are also a pretty healthy occurrences of left shifted and right shifted. So we see that this is around, I don't know, I'm not quite sure, around 10 to 15%, 20% for left and right cases as well, right? So there are kind of a healthy number of counter examples to the left bracket thesis. Here are some examples, but I think in the interest of time, I'm going to skip over them. We can come back to them if you like. So that was it for the background. About half of the presentation was on just giving you the background on this. But now we're going to go through some experiments. So experiment one deals with the question of um, basically if there's a preference for same size conjuncts is sort of and that preference is used to predict upcoming input, how detailed is that prediction? So we're kind of considering two broad viewpoints. One is that you've got a relatively coarse-grained prediction process, so that whenever I get either, I can expect an or, but it's not really that much more detailed, right? It's sort of basic, um, like a dependency, but it's very, very broad, right? So if I get either, I have no specific predictions about what's coming up next, except that I'm going to see a disjunction of some kind. A more fine-grained possibility is that you predict the size of the disjunct through the location of either, right? So that if I have either that appears above a CP, then I can expect that I will have a disjunction of two CPs, right? And that's given by this constraint here, right? And so you can really expect that if people, as they process sentences are conforming to this constraint, then they might make predictions that obeys or honors that constraint. So that's the first thought. The second research question is that if the processor encounters a disjunction that is in some way contrary to a previous prediction, what will happen? So does it abandon it? Does it try to associate the either and the or, even if it's in an illicit position? Or does it wait to find the prediction that it was hoping for to anthropomorphize quite a bit? So the coarse-grained view would have it that you just have an advantage or a facilitation for or regardless of the position of either, right? So basically it's just that it doesn't really once you see or it's happy, right? It's sort of basic in that way. A more fine-grained view is that you would have facilitation for or in just the predicted positions for either. So that if I've got either and I have an illicit or that goes against this sort of CP constraint, the parser is not going to really be affected by it. So these are kind of two viewpoints. For the first two experiments, we're going to be using eye tracking while reading. And this is, as I'm sure you know, a measure of the moment by moment movement, it's tough to say, of eyes during reading, right? So basically, it's great because we have this sort of millisecond timing. You can track the location of the eyes. And it's useful because it allows a fairly natural measure of processing times, and it's got a well-established and strong linking hypothesis in which longer reading times are associated with greater processing difficulties, right? So the longer I spend on a word or a region, the more cognitive reserves or resources I've had to allocate in order to parse or interpret that word or region. There are lots of measures on these regions, and I'll introduce them as we go along. Okay, so experiment one was a 2 by 2. And these sentences are a bit brutal. I'm gonna admit that just up front, but we had a lot of constraints that we were trying to meet here. So we manipulated the placement of either. It would appear high, and by high we mean at a CP, and I'll give you an example in just a second. We also have low either that appeared at the left edge of a noun, of an object noun. So we had evidently the babysitter said either that Britt ate a popsicle or an ice cream cone before dinner, or that Bobby also wanted something sweet. So this is brutal in the sense that we've got multiple ors, right? We've got this illicit or that's sort of independent of the prediction of either. And then we have the expected clausal disjunction, which is always here, or that Bobby, right? So either that, and then you predict this CP, and then you eventually will get the predicted disjunction later on here. So here, the question is, do you revise upon encountering this illicit or unexpected or do you wait for a CP disjunction? In the low either case, so this is the babysitter said that Britt ate either a popsicle or an ice cream cone, or that Bobby also wanted something sweet. Either is now just on the left edge of a object disjunction. And here, right, the predictions for either would be supported, right? So you would expect a DP or an object disjunction here, but not necessarily a clausal disjunction that would follow. So that was two of the cases. The other two are pretty much the exact same. So again, you've got high either and low either, but now we've manipulated the connective that appears between the two objects. So the babysitter said either that Britt ate a popsicle and an ice cream cone, or that Bobby also wanted something sweet. So here, right, you have a CP disjunction, right? That was predicted, we expect by the location of either, and that prediction is realized here. You don't have an intervening or. Low either, pretty much the same deal. The babysitter said that Britt ate either a popsicle and an ice cream cone, or that Bobby also wanted something sweet. That was really tough to say because it violates this prediction for an object disjunction here. So there should be some kind of failure. And the idea is, well, do you then also have any kind of advantage for looking at the clausal disjunction? So the coarse-grained approach would expect or lead us to predict that you would have general and equal facilitation for disjunction after either. And a more fine-grained view is that this facilitation is really dependent on the position of either itself. So what do we see? Well, let's first look at first pass times, and this is the sum of all fixations when first entering a region, right? So the idea is that when you look to a region, you spend a certain amount of time on it, and first pass durations are the sum of all of those fixations on a word or a region before you leave to either the left or to the right. And so these are this is sort of the grand average is at 0, and this is helpful for seeing the size of the effect here. So we see that in the disjunction case, so when you have a disjunction in the first clause, that was this case here, right? You've got a popsicle or an ice cream cone. We find that there's a penalty for high either and an advantage for low either, right? So what this seems to indicate is that the processor is not ignoring this illicit or. It's trying to associate either and an or, but that comes at a certain cost, right? So you've made a prediction, it's failed, and you become disrupted in a way. If you have a conjunction in the previous clause, well, you find that there's sort of the opposite effect. So there's a penalty now for the low either, right? And so this is sort of what I was saying. It was hard to say because you're violating that prediction. Okay, so now we're going to look at the first past times on the clausal disjunction, and this is the phrase or that Bobby. And what we find here is that at the disjunction, you find again that there's a penalty for the high either case, right? So if you've had a previous or, and then you have an or that kind of coheres with your expectations, then you have a penalty. But if you haven't seen a previous or and you have a high either, then you have an advantage, right? So it really looks like readers are making fairly fine-grained predictions on the basis of either, but that those predictions are subject to alternative analyses, right? So this is pretty much what I've said, right? We've got evidence for fine-grained prediction, but there's also some evidence that the parser was tempted by this initial or, right? And what's interesting about this is that these aren't garden path sentences. There's no kind of temporary ambiguity here, right? So these are, despite their complexity, arguably a little bit more naturalistic. Okay, so experiment two follows up on experiment one, in that the parsers seem to be tempted by this initial or, and it could have prompted a kind of revised prediction, right? So the question here is whether disconfirmed predictions would continue to affect later processing. And we'll again consider two possibilities. In a lingering analysis, here you would have that you've made a prediction and it continues to be active, right? You haven't dispelled, you haven't dispensed with it once you find counter evidence. So to kind of walk us through the predictions here, at either you would predict a CP disjunct. Let's say you encounter an illicit or unexpected or, well, under this account, the initial prediction would then facilitate a later CP disjunct, right? So this is the idea, just to put it in different words. You expected a CP, you got something different, but you haven't gotten rid of that prediction yet. The alternative really is just that you abandon analyses when they're not realized, right? That makes some sense, I think. So here you would predict a CP disjunct. You get that illicit or unexpected or, but having made that prediction doesn't really help you in later processing. Right, so we're gonna design an experiment, or we already designed an experiment to test these two possibilities. These are taken in large part from the previous experiment, but with a slightly different manipulation. So here we manipulated just the presence or absence of either, which always appeared as a kind of above the clause. So it was always a high either. And then we always had an or in the NP or object position. But then what we changed was whether you had the prediction for a clausal disjunction, like or that Bobby, was realized or not, right? So it's basically like, is the initial or the one that you have to associate either with, or do you have another opportunity to satisfy that prediction? So the sentences were like, the babysitter said either that Britt ate a popsicle or an ice cream cone, or that Bobby also wanted something sweet. right? So here you would realize the prediction. Or the babysitter said either that Britt ate a popsicle or an ice cream cone and that Bobby also wanted something sweet, right? So here you don't have the advantage of realizing the clausal disjunction. So the lingering analysis would predict that high either provides an advantage for the clausal disjunction only, despite having previously encountered in or, if it is indeed true, that the processor sort of maintains a prediction for clausal disjunction. And as I said, we used as a baseline the same sentences, but without either for comparison. Okay, so here's what we found. We're now looking at go past times because really what we care about is the clausal disjunction or that Bobby. And go past times include first past times, but it's basically the time from first entering a region until going past it on the right. So if someone has entered a word or a region and they go backwards, that counts in terms of the calculation of go past times. So it will include, by definition, first past times. So what we see here is that there was an advantage for a clausal disjunction for high either only, right? So here we've got that there's a, and going down, of course, means that there's an advantage. So for high either, if you've got a disjunction, then you're happy, right? And so this was important because in all of our sentences, there was a previous or that could have been associated with either. And you find a penalty now for no either, and there was no difference for a conjunction. We also see some sort of an opposite effect at the spillover region. So this is the region that follows the clausal connective. And in kind of eye tracking research, self-paced reading, you often find effects that occur after the critical region, and we call this the spillover. So here what we find is that there's an interaction, so that there was a penalty for high either when there was no clausal disjunction, right? So here, right, you've predicted that you should have an or that, but you don't find it, right? And we see that there's just a penalty when you have either compared to no either. Okay, so these are our just to kind of summarize experiment 2. Let's check how I'm on time. Okay. That there was again additional evidence for fine-grained prediction, and that there was an advantage for clausal disjunction for high either. And so there was a penalty for a no clausal disjunction case when you've made the prediction, but it fails to get realized despite the fact that there was an earlier or. And so we take this as evidence that readers make structural predictions and that they are maintained in memory. All right, so I'm gonna just skip over this summary in interest of time. And to talk about experiment 3, I'm gonna just do a brief interlude on what's called parallelism. So previous research has found that coordinate structures are easier to process when the sentences are parallel in various ways. So you have similar syntactic structures like pairing actives with actives and passives with passives. If both have DP objects of a similar type, if they share thematic roles, if they're matched in prosodic weight, and so on. There's been quite a bit of research on this. My numbering got a bit off, but hopefully you can see what I'm trying to say here. In early example comes from Fraser 84, and they looked at cases like 4A and B. So Jim believed all Tom's stories, and Sue believed Jim's stories, right? So here you've got believe, and it's occurring with DP arguments. But believe can also take a sentence complement. So Jim believed all Tom's stories, same as before, and Sue believed Jim's stories were fictitious. And people find this a lot harder to interpret. And the explanation is that there's a lack of parallelism between the clauses. So we're going to use this in order to sort of probe a bit more how prediction might interact with these more general processing principles. The question is whether comprehenders predict an animate disjunct on the basis of parallelism. And it was found, if you recall, in previous work, that either reduced reading times on the verb, even when the NP was an implausible animate object like her husband. So we've got two possibilities here that, again, we want to consider. One is the strong prediction view. And this is that readers will use either to anticipate a sentence disjunction and fail to even consider the object interpretation, just irrespective of animacy, right? So they get like I think it was Linda bought the red car or her husband, right? So here, if they have either, then they're going to use that in order to avoid the incorrect interpretation entirely. I think this is unlikely given what we've seen in the past experiments, but it's a possibility. So here, in effect, animacy shouldn't affect the parses that readers consider. The second case is prediction with parallelism, and that's while, again, readers might use either to anticipate the upcoming structure, they still consider the object interpretation, but just for animate DPs, right? So this would have something like either Linda bought the red car or her motorcycle. Here, this is an inanimate noun, so you might be more likely to make this an object interpretation versus either Linda bought the red car or her husband. Here, maybe then you consider a uh, that her husband is not the object, but rather a subject. And that would help you avoid a possible garden path. So we're going to use a slightly different method here called the maze task. And the motivation is that methods like eye tracking and EEG, as we've seen in the past, require quite a bit of resources, equipment, lab space, research assistance, funding, and so on. Um, Internet-based studies reduce the overhead to a large extent, and there are some concerns with more traditional tasks like self-paced reading because the locus of the effect can be distributed across many different regions. You get this spillover effect that we saw in the eye tracking experiment. So in recent years, people have been turning more and more to this maze task alternative, and it's become quite popular. So this comes from the Ken Forster paper that introduced this idea. And basically, I'll just sort of skip to the demonstration. You've got two options in each frame. So you've got the, and then here you've got a bunch of X's. But then when you get, and you have to choose which option is grammatically correct. So if I've got two options and I pick the, and then in the next frame I get gone and dog. And I know that dog is the only grammatical continuation, and I can go through this. The dog chased our cat, right? And there are lots of different variants, but in all of them you have two options, and only one of them is a grammatically possible continuation. And subjects are informed if they make the incorrect choice. And we had comprehension questions after some trials to assess how well people were actually paying attention. So the design is now a little bit different. It was modeled after Staub and Clifton and Staub's original work, but we had a lot of items. So we have 42 sextets, and here we cross the presence or absence of either, along with certain properties that occur in the second disjunct. And I want to say that these are all garden path sentences, and they're all to be disambiguated towards a sentence disjunction. So we had things like either John tripped on a branch or a tree, right? And again, this should be not possible given the constraint that we talked about. But then it's followed up with fell into the lake behind the house. And so what we manipulated was what occurred in the second disjunct. There was no comma inanimate, and this is kind of the baseline, where the parallelism with the sentence disjunction expectation is violated. We had a case that was inanimate, but with a comma, right? So comma or a tree. And so here you've got a violation, but you've signaled that you've got a clause. Or a sorry, this should be a no comma and animate. So either John tripped on a branch or a gardener fell into the lake behind the house. And so this then would be compatible with the expectations from um, parallelism. And the idea here is that you've got an animate subject here and then an animate subject in just the last case here. So I'm going to just briefly, how much time do I have? Uh, okay, so I'm gonna have to actually skip through this a little bit. Here, well, let me just say it briefly. So here we've got, here are the predictions for prediction with parallelism. You've got either John tripped on a branch or, and here this would lead you to a strong expectation for an animate subject, right? But then you get a tree, and so this should correspond to a mismatch if you have either. And then at the verb, the structure is fully disambiguated. The same kind of predictions hold for the comma case, except the question is whether or not having a comma will then facilitate, um, uh, will allow you to avoid a misinterpretation or will allow you to recover from it faster. But either way, you'd probably expect a subject mismatch. And then in the case with the animate, again, once you hit or, you have a strong expectation for an animate subject. In this case, you get your animate subject, so you should have an advantage. And again, the verb disambiguates. So just to take a look at the predictions in terms of visuals, we expect to find an advantage for either. So it's these guys here compared to no either in each of the conditions, right? But then what gets a little more interesting is what happens on the noun and the regions that follow. So in the no comma inanimate case, we expect to find an interaction, right? So that even though you had an advantage once you got to or, now when you have either, that's the sort of blue-green line, there you should find a penalty because of the subject mismatch, right? You've seen tree, but you expected something animate. So there should be a cost there. In the no comma animate case, here you should find that there's a continued advantage for having either. You made a prediction, and that prediction is realized, and so that eases your processing time. The big question is what happens in the comma inanimate case, and there are a few options, but we think I thought it was likely that inanimates will pattern together if the comma is not a strong cue to like a sentence disjunction. If it is a strong cue, then it should pattern more like the no comma animate case. So here's what we found. And I'll go through these by the important regions. But first of all, we see that there's this advantage for either at the region containing or, right? So that's kind of a sanity check, and that occurs in all of the conditions. And then what we see is this sort of interesting interaction. So there's a penalty on the noun when you have either compared to when you don't, right? So this would lead you to expect then that the parser has made a prediction and that prediction has failed in some way. And crucially, we see the opposite effect for the animate case. So you find an advantage for either, it's lower on the noun and the verb as well. right? So there's a differential processing cost depending on the animacy of the noun in the second disjunct. This really says just the same thing, and since we're running out of time, I will skip through it, but just the thing to note here is that where either had a cost on the noun region for the inanimates, it actually had an advantage on the no comma animate case, right? So that's the crucial effect, and that advantage seemed to persist even on the verb itself. Okay, so these are the main findings from experiment 3. And so just to kind of sum up, we found an advantage for or after having seen either in all cases. And we find a differential effect of either that can be attributed to the kind of the application of parallelism, in that we found a penalty for inanimate DPs. And you can again say that this is due to an expectation of an animate subject due to parallelism. Okay, so I've given you a lot and had to sort of speed through the last bit, and I just want to sum up with 4 things that I think we might have learned. The first thing is that the parser seems to make both coarse and fine-grained structural predictions, right? In that we find that non-local structure appears to be projected ahead of the input, and that there are penalties when these predictions are not realized. And this is sort of seen in various ways throughout all of the experiments. Crucially, we also find that the parser does not ignore illicit structure, right? So that there was a penalty for this unanticipated or in experiment 1. You predicted a CP dis disjunction and you get a object disjunction, and so there's a kind of penalty there. The third thing is that these unrealized structural predictions are not abandoned, so that there's an advantage when the prediction is supported, say, with a clausal disjunct, despite the appearance of an earlier or. And that was shown in experiment 3. Finally, the fourth thing is that structural predictions appear to interact in interesting ways with more general parsing principles, and that we found that there's a differential effect of either that depends on the animacy of the second disjunct. And so there are a few ways of interpreting this. You could have a fine-grained view in which you sort of just predict any kind of parallel structure, or maybe you have a very fine-grained view, as I've been assuming, is that you're predicting in particular a animate subject. So just to wrap up, and I promise this is the last slide, the parser is not only incremental, but also highly predictive, and many cases of anticipation. So it kind of adds to the long list of evidence for prediction at various levels of linguistic representation, which would suggest that it's kind of a core property of the processing system, and that it really goes kind of beyond just the lexical level and is really can anticipate structure. Um, Prediction appears to be relatively fine-grained, and by that I mean specific, but it's also robust in that it persists despite counter evidence. I lied. That wasn't the last slide. This is, I think, the last slide. We're doing a number of different studies looking at different correlative structures that allow us to play with different kinds of properties. So that's part of the larger project in which this is situated. So yeah, this has been presented at various places, and I'd like to thank Stephanie Rich, who's been amazing in all of this. Yes, so that's it. Thank you all, and I look forward to talking about this with you more.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your work here with us. And now we have, I think, like, yeah, 30 minutes for questions here or in YouTube. So, está abierto el espacio para preguntas. También invitamos a las personas que nos están viendo en directo por YouTube a que las hagan en el chat en vivo. ¿Alguna pregunta aquí en el auditorio?
Hey, hi Jesse. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks for this. This is really great. I was curious about the parallelism story. So did I understand correctly that you're favoring the strong claim that people will predict animacy based because of the parallelism? Okay. Is there a particular reason why you pick animacy for the experiment? Was it out of like convenience for the design, or would you? Yeah. Would you? Yeah. Sorry.
No, yeah. Convenience in part. I mean, so it's to follow up on the Staub and Clifton claim, which I sort of thought was a bit strange. Well, strange in the sense that it wasn't expected. And they make that claim on the basis of looking at two separate experiments and then comparing them. But there hasn't really, to my knowledge, been anything that's looked at this effect within the same experiment. And that's the main reason I, yeah, use animacy. But do you have other thoughts of other properties that you could use?
Well, I was just wondering whether you would extend this to like, because for example, when you talked about the Fraser paper that it discusses kind of like passives, like passive parallelisms and stuff, whether you would extend this kind of claim to other things beyond amnesty, like that
Yeah.
the ego or correlates, like, yeah.
That's a really interesting question. So, animacy is nice in English because it can, it's predictive of the subject and that interacts with the garden path. And so it has a kind of like immediate interpretive value that I think is very nice to explore. But your point is great in that, you could kind of poke at or probe the extent to which, like really any feature might be part of this process, right? And these materials were hard to create because, I didn't want to use passives because I wanted to have both actives and passives in the same frame. So they all had to be of a certain verb type. Yeah. So that took a bit of work. Yeah.
Yeah, so the one thing I was thinking about is like, I don't know if you did it like in German and you had like
Yeah.
change the
Yeah.
case pattern. So you would probably also find that there was kind of the intuition that I would have like that you would like make a strong case prediction, and then if you have a different one, but and then I
Yeah.
guess the related question that I had was so I guess these questions came about. I'm not a native English speaker, but I to me the sentence just sounds like totally fine when you say like either John fell down the branch or the tree was struck by lightning.
Yeah.
Or something like that, right? So I was when I was like saying this in my head, I realized like, oh, I wonder if like instead of the comma, which I think was something you were trying to do soon, was if you had it like with like a different type of intonational contour.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think that's another important point. Like it would be really, the comma really didn't seem to have much of an effect,
Yeah.
right? And in work that I know of, again by Adrian Staub, that commas sort of have a variable effect. And there's been some interesting work I think that shows, maybe by Steinhauer, and colleagues that like the extent to which you attend to a comma really sort of depends um, on how prescriptive of an orthographic grammar you have. So I probably should have looked at the extent to which um, people are aware or are concerned with commas as grammatical indicators. And this is sort of a roundabout way of addressing your question because, sometimes people think of commas as being prosodic markers as well. They're used in ways that like are prescriptively inaccurate, but that kind of conform with prosodic breaks. So, but I love that idea, and it would be great to do this in a more kind of auditory domain to really address the extent to which it's the comma, or if it's the indicator of like a strong prosodic break. Yeah, I can't answer that, but I think it's a great
Thank you.
idea.
¿Una otra pregunta?
Hi, Jesse. Thank you for your presentation.
Hola.
Enjoy it a lot. I would like to ask you a very specific question regarding the representation, the three representations that you have on this phenomena.
Yep.
And you mentioned that some authors have claimed that either cannot be positioned on the left periphery because it violates whatever, something that they, I don't know if you mentioned that or I missed it or what. I was just thinking, what's the nature from a syntactic point of view of the expression either or not, well, either or neither nor. If it's a real constituent, I mean, like one constituent,
Yeah.
farther away in the structure is one of them, then it violates or not what we call in syntax C command.
Right.
And I don't know if you have thought of that, because that means that speakers do have an internalized structure on how these compos work, and therefore the penalty or the successful prediction of what comes next, right?
Right.
I don't know if it's a question, but I was just thinking about that. How far can you separate these combinations, and if that breaks this principle of C command?
Mm.
Or are they really two constituents? When you have either as a on top of its own MP or DP or CP, and then you have or, and behind that you have its own CP, and then you shouldn't have any expectations of C command. And when they do make the parallelism, then that's where the violation occurs. Well, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, or if I was clear at all.
No, I think these questions make a ton of sense, and thank you for raising them. So some of this is beyond my pay grade as a syntactician, because I'm not really a card-carrying syntactician, but so the account for why you get the distribution of either an or across CP boundaries varies depending on your account. So I briefly mentioned these different analyses. There was the movement approach of Larson, where in essence, I mean, he claims that once you have either, so it's sort of generated at the left, right, at the leftmost bracket of a disjunction, but for various reasons, it can move, right? And so the way that he would account for this distribution is to say that there's a constraint on movement. And it's a compelling account because it follows the other constraints on movement about cross and clause boundaries. So I don't, that's one theory. Another is that you've got like an ellipsis account, and that's a little bit harder to capture, I think, this effect, but you would do it by saying that there's a constraint on the size of the ellipsis, or perhaps just a preference. So you can get either in the left periphery, like above a CP, but when you do, it just needs to be conjoined or disjoined with another CP.
Okay.
that's the idea, but I think that's the part that I can't really comment on. Like that's like an observation. And there's some variation, but by and large it's pretty robust. We've done a lot of testing, we've done some corpus work. In corpora, we've never found a violation of the CP constraint.
Absolutely.
Yeah. But in judgments, sometimes people will be sort of when we think this is kind of due to very shallow parsing. You find some variation. But the second part I really want to pick up on because I think that it's at the core of what I'm trying to claim here is that it looks like readers, speakers, comprehenders have some kind of knowledge of this constraint. And that constraint is guiding them in their predictions online. So, if you've kind of looked at the literature on parsing and islands, it's something very similar. So people, often, I mean, there's a lot of work on this, but the basic finding is that by and large, you don't want to have a gap inside of an island, right? And so people get surprised if they're forced to put a gap site in there, right?
Yeah.
Or the opposite effect, but which shows the same thing, is that if there's some kind of plausibility penalty, it doesn't show up in an island, which would suggest that readers are not trying to connect a filler and the gap site inside of an island. And so kind of all of this is to say is that it fits in line, I think, with the literature that suggests that we do have this kind of complex knowledge and representation, and that those representations and that information is deployed as we process incrementally.
Absolutely. Well,
Yeah.
thank you very much.
Yep. Thank you.
Well, there's one more question. There a gap? No.
Sorry, yeah, hi again. Just out of curiosity, at the beginning we talked about that the not only but was your favorite. So I was kind of wondering if you could like elaborate on that a bit.
Yeah. So this is kind of an old project, and I didn't revisit it that much. But so why I like it so much is that it really does seem to involve prosody. So I've done a bunch of experiments and some corpus work that would seem to suggest, in line with either, that readers do make predictions about what's coming up next on the basis of not only. This morning I took out the examples because I didn't think I would get into them, and now I'm regretting it. Let me see. I might have them written down somewhere because I'm getting old and I'm forgetting things. Okay, so things like okay. Okay, so you can have John ate not only rice, but also beans, right? And that follows with this sort of local NP interpretation, but you can also have John not only ate rice, but also beans, as opposed to, and this is one thing that I like about it is that you get inversion. So not only did John eat rice, but also beans. And what's sort of interesting about these cases is that they aren't subject to the same constraints that either and or is. And so some of the work here has been arguing that really what we have here is not only is a focus marker and it's marking contrast, right? And then in the second conjunct after the, but also you're hitting ellipsis. So as long as the contrast is holding between the two conjuncts, then it looks like people don't have difficulty processing it. But if you've got something like, let me just sort of take a look at my examples. Okay, so if you've got something like Abe claimed that the gardener picked not only a tulip, but also a rose, right? Here you've got the kind of contrast and line. But you can also have a case of not only did Abe claimed not only did the gardener pick a tulip, but she also picked a rose, right? So here you've got a kind of a what's like a right shifted variant. And as long as the shifting marks the location of the contrast, then it seems like you don't have any kind of processing penalty. But then when not only doesn't indicate where the contrast is, then it looks like it's sort of like an unlicensed deviation. So we've been doing a fair number of experiments in eye tracking, um, and we did some corpus work on this. And it's kind of a fun construction because there's a lot happening there.
Yes, thank you. I was thinking a little bit along those lines with prosody, but also not only, but intuitively, it seems like this one, the structure can be used to mark some like a difference in importance.
Yeah.
So, like, a little bit similar to like even.
Yeah.
So like not only did the gardener find dirt, he also found gold.
Yeah.
Kind of like so there's I don't know if you share this intuition that this is kind of like and that would be interesting to like see how that works. So like whether people expect kind of like the second one to be a more important or more dramatic one, like and whether this kind of prediction would like and kind of also go along with the other two predictions that you were talking about. But
I think that that's a really interesting observation, and I share the intuition. It's a lot like these constructions with let alone, which I've done a fair bit of work on. And so there, one idea from Maziar Hamdani is that there's a kind of a contextual entailment between the two clauses. But it also would seem that, why are you mentioning something that's contextually entailed? It has a rhetorical effect, and I think one of these is importance. So yeah, cool. Thank you.
no, thank you. Great.
Aún tenemos tiempo para una última pregunta, si gusta. Well, it seems like we don't have more questions.
Fair.
Well, that's it. So thank you again so much for sharing your work with us. It
Thank
was
you.
so interesting. And thank you also for being with us then.
Thank you all. It was
Thank you.
really fun.
Bueno, a continuación continuaremos con la ponencia del día de hoy, que corre a cargo del licenciado Axel. Un momento les digo el nombre. Por el licenciado Axel Cerratos, su ponencia se titula La resolución de referencias pronominales en oraciones globalmente ambiguas por hablantes de la variante mexicana del español como L1. Un aplauso, por favor.
Otro. Ya, listo. Ahora sí, me gustaría comenzar por decir que se decidió que la presentación sea en inglés porque uno de mis sinodales está siguiendo la transmisión en YouTube y sería más fácil compartir los detalles en inglés para que la discusión fluya mejor más adelante. Y pues pensé que el encuentro ya ha tenido Spanglish, entonces, pues, ¿por qué no? Eh, bueno, entonces cambiamos. If we were to read a sentence like the one we have here, Juan vio a Carlos cuando él caminaba por la playa, who would we say was walking on the beach? It's easy, right? Well, it's actually a question that we've been trying to answer for about 2 decades now. It could be the case that Juan was the one walking on the beach, but it could also be Carlos. And if we want to get technical, it could also be someone else in the discourse context. And this linguistic phenomenon is known as pronoun resolution in globally ambiguous sentences, and in my case, by native speakers of Mexican Spanish. And that's precisely the focus of my master's thesis, and I approached it from both a generative and an experimental perspective. As I've hinted, this phenomenon has attracted considerable attention from researchers across various languages. And it all started with Gavinati's doctoral dissertation in 2002, in which she proposes the position of antecedent strategy, or PAS, from now on. And this strategy predicts that in globally ambiguous contexts, native speakers of Italian prefer to resolve the reference in favor of the subject when we have no pronouns, and in favor of the object with overt pronouns. That means that in our example sentence, according to the PAS, the referent here would be Carlos, since we have an overt pronoun él here. But that's the case of Italian. The PAS had such an impact that researchers soon began exploring it in other pro-drop languages. Here we have just a few cases: Turkish, Greek, Catalan, Croatian, and of course, Spanish. And interestingly, these studies have reported differing conclusions. Some claim that the PAS explains what happens in other languages, while others suggest that other factors might play a stronger role in the resolution. The case of Spanish is particularly intriguing, and the available studies can be roughly grouped into 3 camps. The first one argues that the PAS applies to Spanish too. So null pronouns prefer subjects, overt pronouns prefer objects. The second group also supports the PAS in Spanish, but they point out that a clear preference is only observed with null pronouns. Curiously, though, the third group, which happens to include the only available studies using online paradigms, tells a different story. So they say that pronouns, overt pronouns, prefer objects, but that null pronouns show no clear preference at all. So who was walking on the beach again? And this led me to ask, could other factors play an equally or even more relevant role than the type of pronoun in the resolution? And in my work, I explore these 2. The first one is the clause distribution, whether it is main subordinate or subordinate main, and the reference hierarchical position, so whether it precedes the ambiguous pronoun or not. So the first one we can observe in the first example we have here. It's the same we had at the beginning, just with the opposite clause distribution. Cuando él caminaba por la playa, Juan vio a Carlos. And then in the second one, we have the same sentence again, but we, where the competing reference do not precede the ambiguous pronoun. Él caminaba por la playa cuando Juan vio a Carlos. So, I went back. My research questions are the 3 you see here. The first one, how do speakers of Mexican Spanish resolve pronominal references in globally ambiguous sentences with overt versus null pronouns? The second one, is there a preference in referent assignment based on clause distribution? If so, what is it? And the third one, is there a preference in referent assignment based on referent position? Once again, if so, what is it? These are the 4 hypotheses I formulated, and it's important to note that although the type of pronoun was considered an independent variable, the predictions were specifically framed around the other 2, clause distribution and the referent position. The first one is the one we have here for sentences with the main subordinate order and the reference, preceding reference, like here, Juan vio a Carlos cuando él caminaba por la playa, or with little pro. And here I think that the resolution is going to be resolved, the reference is going to be resolved in favor of the object. In the second condition, we have main subordinate again, but this time the reference do not precede the ambiguous pronoun, like it is the case here. Él caminaba por la playa cuando Juan vio a Carlos. And I think in this kind of configuration, the reference is going to be resolved in favor of an exophoric referent. In the third one, we have the opposite clause distribution, subordinate main, and then the 2 possible, 3 reference as preceding the ambiguous pronoun, cuando Juan vio a Carlos, él caminaba por la playa. And I think this one is going to be resolved in favor of the subject. And in the last configuration, we have subordinate main again, and this time the reference do not precede the ambiguous pronoun. And once again, I think it is going to be resolved in favor of the subject. And now, I would love to dive into the syntactic derivations that might explain why these predictions are the way they are, but I will have to keep it brief. So here we have a sentence with a main subordinate order and antecedent reference. So we have Frida llamó a Jimena cuando ella estaba paseando el perro. And I think that the reference is going to be assigned to the object, in this case, Jimena. And I argue this because the adverbial clause is likely adjoined low. And I think this because of Frazier's late closure principle. And I propose that the complement of the verb phrase, in this case, Jimena, becomes the most accessible referent because both the ambiguous pronoun, in this case here, and Jimena, are both in the same syntactic phrase and syntactic phase. So this means that they are going to be sent to the semantic interpretation in the phonological form at the same time. And as a result, the referent would no longer be available for other syntactic operations. Now, for sentences with a pre-post subordinate clause and non-antecedent reference, like here, cuando ella estaba paseando el perro, Frida llamó a Jimena, I think that the resolution will tend to favor the subject, in this case, Frida. This time it cannot be explained in terms of whether the adjunction is high or low, but I think that it would align with psycholinguistic findings on the processing cost of pre-post subordinate clauses. So I think it wouldn't be surprising that speakers would favor a hierarchically closer and more discourse prominent referent like the subject. Now, in sentences with a main subordinate order and once again non-antecedent reference, like here, ella estaba paseando el perro cuando Frida llamó a Jimena, I think that the resolution is going to be resolved in favor of an exophoric reference. Why? Well, when checking whether the 2 R expressions we have here, Frida and Jimena, were free in their respective domains, according to principle C of binding theory, we can see that they are free in their local domain, but they are not free in all domains. So this would make the exophoric option the most likely, if not the only one. And finally, for pre-post subordinate clauses with antecedent reference, so cuando Frida llamó a Jimena, ella estaba paseando el perro, I think that the reference is going to be resolved in favor of the subject once again. Again, due to the processing burden of pre-post clauses. And this is also consistent with syntactic discursive proposals regarding subject prominence and how topic versus non-topic antecedents are processed. So what I'm saying is that resolving reference to the subject in these syntactic configurations is simply less costly. Now let me briefly share a few details about the study. It was a quantitative experimental study with an outline interpretation task using a multifactorial design and a within subjects design. I worked with 256 students from UNAM, specifically students enrolled in the foreign language courses here at ENET. And the number of participants was decided following the general guideline about having more or less 4 times the amount of experimental conditions in each group. So we had 32 participants in average in each of the groups. Now, I collected the data through a questionnaire-based interpretation task. The stimuli were globally ambiguous sentences containing interclausal pronominal references, and the participants were asked to read the stimuli and disambiguate the reference by explicitly selecting one of the 3 possible references. The first one was the constituent in the specifier position of the tense phrase, the subject, a constituent in a lower position, the object, or an exophoric referent. And here we have an example of a target item. Cuando José saludó a Sergio, cruzaba la calle principal. They had the question that forced them to disambiguate the reference. And we had these 3 responses. So José, Sergio, and someone else. Some important characteristics of the target items. They averaged 9.8 words per sentence. Whenever the second clause contained the ambiguous pronoun, whether it was null or overt, it systematically appeared in the 6th position. All subordinate clauses were introduced by the temporal adverb cuando. And in terms of aspect, one clause had a perfective aspect and the other imperfect aspect. Regarding other items, each participant completed a training item first, which also contained interclausal reference, but this one was not globally ambiguous. This one was resolved by gender agreement. So we have Abril miró a Ignacio mientras él nadaba en el río, and then the options, Abril, Ignacio, and so on. There were also 8 distractor items, which also served as control items. 2 of them were resolved by principle B of binding theory, 2 by number agreement, 2 by gender agreement, world knowledge, basically plausibility. The data collection was conducted in situ across 12 physical groups from ENET's foreign language courses. There were groups from the French, Portuguese, German, and English courses. And the idea of doing it face-to-face was to control the completion time and to minimize the interruptions. And it's important to mention that although I worked with 12 fixed groups, the software that I used for the questionnaire randomly assigned each participant to one of the 8 experimental groups. And also the order for each participant, the order in which the items appear for each participant was different. And another important thing is that no target item ever appeared right after another target item. We had at least one distractor item in between. Now let's look at the results. This graph shows the frequency of reference selection by condition. So I ran chi-square goodness and fit tests to verify whether a higher frequency of selection truly reflected a preference. And preference was clear and also in line of the hypotheses in 3 out of 4 conditions. So conditions 2, 3, and 4. But something still bothered me. I wonder, why was the preference split almost evenly in condition 1? It was like 48% of times and 50% of times. And then why was condition 2 the only with such a clear preference? This was like 80% of the times. So I went back to the data and waited for them to speak to me, like my professors used to say. And they did, because I identified 2 confounding variables. But to do that, I think it would be helpful to display the 8 conditions here. And I'm going to read them one by one. Remember that the variables interacting are clause distribution, the position of the referent, and the type of pronoun. So condition 1 is this one here. Juan vio a Carlos cuando él caminaba por la playa. Second one, Juan vio a Carlos cuando caminaba por la playa. Third one, él caminaba por la playa cuando Juan vio a Carlos, caminaba por la playa cuando Juan vio a Carlos, cuando Juan vio a Carlos, él caminaba por la playa, cuando Juan vio a Carlos, caminaba por la playa, cuando él caminaba por la playa, Juan vio a Carlos, and lastly, cuando caminaba por la playa, Juan vio a Carlos. Now, in conditions 3 and 4, I went back to the syntactic derivations that I proposed, and I realized that the principle C of binding theory might have biased these results. And I mean, the manipulated variables surely played a role, but I think that these syntactic constraints were more likely to influence the decision, and we will see why in a second. And the second issue was that 2 of the target items contained commutative clauses in the main clause, such as X was playing with Y and X was talking with Y. And I ran a chi-square test for independence, and it confirmed that commutative clauses reduced the likelihood of participants selecting the object as the referent. So I decided to guide my statistical analysis by the research questions instead. On one hand, I needed to confirm whether each independent variable had a significant effect. And the chi-square tests for independence showed that all of the interactions but one were statistically significant. Here we have the ones for clause order. Here we have the ones for the hierarchical position of the referent. And in this one, we have the statistical tests for the type of pronoun. And as you can see here, the only one that wasn't significant is the one where we have conditions 3 and 4, which happen to be the conditions that were influenced by principle C of binding theory, which makes total sense. Well, and let me see. Yeah, I'm going to skip this. My research questions also were trying to explore the referential preference per variable. And again, I used chi-square tests for both independence and goodness of fit to determine these preferences, which I will summarize in the findings because I'm running out of time. So to summarize the main findings, let's return to the research questions. The first was, how do Mexican speakers of Mexican Spanish resolve pronominal references in globally ambiguous sentences with overt versus null pronouns? And the chi-square tests indicate that in anaphoric contexts, only overt pronouns are consistently associated with object antecedents. And in contrast, null pronouns show no clear preference for either possible referent. The second question asked, is there a preference in referent assignment depending on clause distribution? If so, what is it? And the interpretation judgments showed a systematic pattern. Main subordinate clauses tend to favor object antecedents, while subordinate main tend to favor subject antecedents, sorry. And the third question was, is there a preference depending on referent position? If so, what is it? And the results show that antecedent position alone does not determine a preference for the subject or the object. However, reference in marked positions, so non-antecedents, consistently promote subject readings. And well, as I discussed, this may be due to syntactic factors, but also discursive and cognitive factors. I was thinking of garden path sentences now that Jesse mentioned them, because just like it happens with those sentences, ambiguity can go unnoticed. So in cataphoric references, I think that we might resolve the reference in favor of the first referent that appears, which happens to be the subject of the second clause, owing to morphological compatibility. So maybe without even realizing that the object was also compatible morphologically. And finally, the frequency analysis revealed patterns in the interaction between the 3 variables. So when at least 2 of the three variables aligned in the same direction, the assignment was clear and statistically significant. So I want to use condition 7 as an example. So we had subordinate main, non-preceding reference, and overt pronoun. And in this case, both subordinate main and non-antecedents prefer subjects, but explicit pronouns prefer objects. And the presence of an overt pronoun could not override the presence of a subordinate main distribution and a non-preceding referent. So subjects were favored in that context. But in conditions where two of the variables conflicted, participants showed no clear preference. And actually we had assignments where preferences split in half. In one was like 47 and 47, so it was very close, 48, 50%. And well, that's what I wanted to share with you today. Gracias.
Muchas gracias, Axel, por tu presentación. Ahora, bueno, vienen 10 minutos de ronda de preguntas. También animamos a aquellos que nos están viendo a través de YouTube a que hagan sus preguntas en el chat y se leerán para que el ponente las pueda responder. ¿Una pregunta?
Muchas gracias. Bueno, tenía algunas cosas de clarificación, pero ¿podrías volver a los ejemplos y a los resultados?
Claro. Voy a compartir la pantalla otra vez. Ok. Los ejemplos, ¿está bien? ¿Está de aquí?
Sí. Ok. Y ahora los resultados.
Ok. Creo que este es el que puede ser más útil.
Sí, pero es un poco lenta. Okay. Y la pregunta que le hice a los participantes era ¿de quién están hablando? ¿Era el uno el otro o una tercera persona?
Exacto.
Okay. Ok, bueno. O sea, lo que me está costando un poco es que a mí me da la impresión de que hay como diferencias de felicidad, o sea, de felicidad entre las, se dice en español, felicity, como que algunas me suenan muy, muy mal. No sé,
Ok.
pero como, bueno, yo en español no hablo mucho, pero, o sea, no pensabas recomendar a los participantes la posibilidad también de hacer un rating de qué tan natural te parece esta frase.
No, no lo hicimos.
Pero, o sea, ¿solo mi intuición o para ti te suenan igual de bien todas estas frases, todas estas variantes? Son, por ejemplo, creo que los números 7.
Ok.
La condición 7.
Cuando él caminaba por la playa, Juan vio a Carlos.
No, la 6. Cuando cambio con la playa. Y creo que en este ejemplo, bueno, es que ya lo he visto tantas veces ahora, pero otro que tenías que era cuando José saludó a Sergio, cruzaba la calle principal. Eso te suena perfectamente bien. O sea, soy solo yo, es posible que sea solo yo que me excusaron un poco en el caso. Bueno, la otra pregunta que tenía también como, más de, como de curiosidad y de pura ignorancia. ¿Tú predecirías lo mismo si en vez de tener esta frase introducida por cuando, tuvieras mientras? ¿Sería la misma predicción?
Justamente fue, bueno, tuvimos un preexperimento y en el preexperimento teníamos reactivos con después, mientras y con cuando. Y el comportamiento sí fue diferente. Entonces, al final decidimos quedarnos únicamente con cuando porque de por sí ya había muchas variables interactuando y variables que podían hacer ruido. En esencia, al menos con mientras, yo diría que sí, pero tendría que explorarlo con las derivaciones.
Claro, porque mi intuición ahí, pero al mismo tiempo, o sea, este no es el campo en el que yo trabajo, entonces solo es mi intuición, que la construcción del evento va a influenciar esto, cómo atribuyes como la relación anafónica. O sea, que no solo es como la posición sintáctica de la frase que está introducida, sino también cómo están construyendo el evento en sus cabezas. Y tienes como cuando, si usas de pronto no, estas no las un presente, sino como como en otro como construcción verbal, también podría influenciar eso muchísimo, mucho más que como la posición sintáctica.
Sí, justo acabo de recordar por qué descartamos mientras, y era porque en algunas de las condiciones nos parecía que se activaba otro de los significados de mientras, creo que eran las últimas. Mientras Juan vio a Carlos, él caminaba por la playa, y que ahí podía favorecer mucho el contraste de mientras ellos hacían esto, otra persona hacía esto, que no pasa con cuando. Y acabo de recordar que por eso descartamos mientras.
Gracias.
Gracias.
¿Hay alguna otra pregunta?
Gracias Axel por tu presentación. Viendo estos ejemplos, justamente y retomando la observación de Camilo, sí pudiera ser un poco marcada, por ejemplo, la de 6, cuando Juan vio a Carlos caminar por la playa. Yo no sé si prosódicamente eso se puede atenuar cuando uno, como lo lee en la mente, porque, o sea, si no te están alertando en el experimento, que a lo mejor hay oraciones que no son
Muy naturales.
felicitus, ¿no? Entonces, tú ajustas para que todas sean posibles en la lengua. Entonces, a lo mejor dices, cuando Juan vio a Carlos, caminaba por la playa. O sea, esta pequeña pausa prosódica pudiera atenuar lo marcado de la oración. Y yo no sé si como hablantes normalmente mm, le damos crédito al que nos está presentando esa opción para ajustarlo y decir, no, sí, hay un contexto en donde esto es posible, aunque reconozco que puede ser marcado, ¿no?
O sea, creo que esto me suena marcado por la forma como se está construyendo el evento. Y me suena mucho menos marcado si digo, cuando Juan caminaba, pues las seis, ¿no? Cuando Juan vio a Carlos estaba caminando por la playa.
Okay.
Porque creo que el cuando, no sé, me fuerza como a construir un evento que es como continuo, como que está, no sé, no lo puedo como decir más precisamente, pero me parece que hay muchos factores que están influenciando la construcción del evento y la asignación de la referencia.
O sea, sería más suave si dijeras, estaba caminando por la playa.
Sí, pero no sé, también es solo mi intuición. No sé.
No, no, yo creo que está bien. O sea, yo sí creo que pudiera haber un fenómeno de edición ahí, pero no sé, sí.
Sí, justamente retomando lo que decían los dos, creo que sería muy interesante explorarlo nuevamente, pero con paradigma de mundo visual y con estímulos auditivos, porque lo que pensaba también es que como, pues al final del día no podía controlar cómo leían en la mente los participantes, hay estudios en donde se centran en el foco prosódico, o sea, no únicamente que esté presente el pronombre explícito en español, sino que se los ponían en mayúsculas para que fuera como cuando él caminaba por la playa. Y seguramente algunos de los participantes hicieron eso en sus mentes. Entonces, sí, creo que con estímulos auditivos podría dar datos muy interesantes.
Sería todo en mi caso. Gracias.
Gracias. Gracias.
Pues, muy interesante la investigación. Precisamente es una de las problemáticas que se presenta, sobre todo cuando hablantes mexicanos aprenden un idioma extranjero, por ejemplo el alemán, donde, bueno, cuando en el alemán sabemos que la 3, por ejemplo, no podría empezar con él, ¿no? Porque el pronombre, pues, debemos primero enunciar a quién nos estamos refiriendo, ¿no? Y otra frase, digamos, aclaratoria y que se utiliza mucho en alemán son las Relativsätze. En ese sentido sería Juan, el que caminaba por la playa, vio a Carlos, ¿no?
Okay.
De resolver. Solo que en español así
Sí.
no lo hablamos, así no lo decimos. Entonces, en el caso de alemanes que aprenden español, cuando ven una frase como esa, entonces sí se pierden en de quién estamos hablando, ¿no? En alemán sabemos accent, ¿verdad? Pues los pronombres nominativa, acusativ, dativ cambian, ¿no? Entonces eso da la pauta para una mejor comprensión, pero en el español sí se diluye, ¿no? Esta comprensión. Y pues perfecto, ¿no? Que hagan este tipo de investigaciones. Gracias.
Muchas gracias.
¿Alguna otra pregunta o comentario? Ok, entonces damos por concluida la ponencia del licenciado Axel.